When most of us think about the Great Depression, our minds jump straight to the stock market crash of 1929. But that crash, it wasn't the cause. It was just the trigger. In this explainer, we're going to go under the hood, peel back the layers, and really unpack the hidden cracks in the economy that set the stage for a whole decade of despair. All right, let's get into it. So, our story really kicks off in the 1920s. You know the era. We call it the Roaring Twenties. It was all glitz and glamour, jazz music, and this booming sense of confidence. It felt like the party was just getting started and would never, ever end. But here's the thing. Was any of it really real? When you dig into it, you see that all that prosperity was incredibly deceptive. It was this beautiful, glittering building, sure, but it was built on a foundation that was just riddled with cracks, totally fragile, and ready to crumble at the slightest shake. Okay, so here's our plan. First, we'll peek beneath the surface of the 20s. Then, we're going to identify those huge hidden cracks in the economy. After that, we'll expose the total house of cards that Wall Street had become, witness the Great Collapse itself, and finally, see how this whole disaster created a brand new role for the government. Right, so let's get past all that glitter. At the time, the United States was going through this massive change, right? It was shifting from a country of farms to a country of factories, from rural to urban. And it changed that big, that fast. Well, it was creating all these stresses and imbalances that almost nobody was paying attention to. So what were these huge weaknesses? Let's do a little forensic investigation here. We're going to uncover the three major cracks in the economic foundation that made the whole system just incredibly vulnerable to collapse. The first big crack was the crisis happening down on the farm. See, during World War I, American farmers borrowed a ton of money to plant more crops and feed Europe. But once Europe got back on its feet, that demand just vanished. But the farmers kept producing, which caused prices to totally collapse. They were left with mountains of debt they had no way to repay. Honestly, rural America was already in a depression long before Wall Street crashed. And that brings us to the second major crack. A massive, gaping wealth gap. All the money from the new industries was getting concentrated right at the very top. So you had factories pumping out cars and radios like crazy, but who was going to buy them? The farmers were broke. And the factory workers? Their wages just weren't keeping up. You had this huge crisis of what economists call underconsumption. The country was making way more stuff than ordinary people could actually afford. And the third weakness? Oh, this one was a self-inflicted wound, a truly disastrous policy decision. To protect American companies, Congress passed something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It slapped massive taxes on goods coming into the country. Well, what do you think happened? Other countries immediately retaliated, putting huge tariffs on our products. Global trade just ground to a halt. And this created a terrible feedback loop. European countries owed the U.S. tons of money for war debts, but now they couldn't sell us their goods to earn the dollars to pay us back. It was, in effect, economic self-sabotage on a global scale. So, with the real economy already on such shaky ground, you have to ask, where was all that money at the top going? Well, it wasn't going into building new factories. People weren't buying enough stuff to justify that. No, it poured into Wall Street, turning the stock market into a gigantic, unregulated, speculative casino. And the jet fuel for this casino fire was a practice called buying on margin. It was basically a way for regular people to gamble in the market with money they didn't even have. Let me just walk you through how this worked, because it's pretty wild. Let's say you want to buy $1,000 worth of some hot new stock. You're convinced it's going to go to the moon. Well, with margin, you might only have to put down, say, 10% of your own money. So that's just $100 from your own pocket. And the other $900, you just borrow it directly from your stockbroker, and the only thing securing that loan is the stock itself. I mean, you can already see the danger here, right? But here is the fatal flaw, the absolute killer. What happens if the stock price drops, even a little bit? The broker issues a margin call, which is a terrifying demand to repay that $900 loan immediately. If you don't have the cash, and who did, the broker just sells your stock for whatever he can get. That selling pushes the price down even more, which triggers more margin calls for other people, and on it goes. It was a house of cards built entirely on borrowed money. And in October of 1929, that house of cards came crashing down hard. So now we turn from the causes to the collapse itself and the absolutely devastating human cost it took across the entire nation. Black Tuesday was the spark.
Billions in paper wealth just vanished. But remember, the real weaknesses, the cracks in the foundation, were already there. The crash just destroyed what little confidence was left. And that led to this catastrophic chain reaction. People panicked and ran on the banks, factories shut their doors, and by 1933, we hit a level of unemployment that is just almost impossible for us to imagine today.
The scale of this was just staggering. 1 out of every 4 people in the entire workforce was unemployed. 1 in 4. And that pain was not felt equally. In African American and Latino communities, who were almost always the first to be let go, that rate shot up to 50% or even higher. It was absolute devastation, and there was zero safety net to catch anyone. It was a truly vicious downward spiral. Back then, there was no federal deposit insurance, no FDIC. So a single rumor could start a run on a bank, and poof, people's life savings were gone overnight. More than 9,000 banks failed. With the banks gone, credit completely froze. With no credit, factories shut down. More layoffs meant people spent even less money, which meant more businesses failed. It was just a feedback loop of pure economic terror. And maybe the most heartbreaking sign of this despair were the shanty towns that sprang up on the edges of cities. People who'd lost everything built shelters out of scrap wood, cardboard, whatever they could find, and they bitterly nicknamed these places Hoovervilles, a really powerful symbol of the public's anger and their feeling of being completely betrayed by a system that had failed them. Now, out of this deep, deep crisis and this complete loss of faith, something incredible happened. It set the stage for one of the most fundamental shifts in American history, a complete redefinition of what the government should be and what it was responsible for. And you had this total clash of philosophies. President Hoover, he believed in rugged individualism. He thought the economy would just fix itself, and that giving aid directly to people would somehow weaken them. His big idea was to give loans to big banks and corporations, hoping the benefits would eventually, trickle down to everybody else. But then you had Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, who campaigned on the exact opposite. He promised bold, direct experimentation and federal action, what he called a New Deal for the American people. And the New Deal was, wow, was it a radical change? For the first time, really, the federal government took direct responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. It created huge programs for direct relief and to create jobs. But maybe even more importantly, it started to build the foundations of a permanent, if limited, safety net. Things like unemployment insurance and Social Security, stuff we kind of take for granted today. So in the end, the Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis. It was this really traumatic national lesson. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that in a modern, complex economy, disasters could happen on a scale that individuals, charities, and even cities and states simply couldn't handle. The old way of thinking had completely failed. And that leaves us with this final, really important question to think about. When you look at the whole picture, the casino-like nature of Wall Street, the house of cards built on borrowed money, and just blind optimism, did that inherent instability make creating government regulation and a real federal safety net not just a good idea, but an absolute necessity? It's something worth considering.